small group. So that's what we did. We started out with small groups of learners, and we've run a number of courses since then, about 8 or 9. And some of our courses have instructor evaluations, or using the Moodle assignment feature. And instructor evaluations are always time-consuming and subject area expertise needed, and maybe they're really important for a university-level course which needs to be done in a structured way to meet the requirements of the university for credits. But we don't work in that context. We're not a university. We're not a school. We run online courses as part of our capacity building work. So in a way, we are free to do what we want, and we're just concerned about providing a high-quality experience. We're not bound by any credit requirements or other things that are common in a university. So our context is that we have thousands of potential learners across the world. We've already reached out to maybe about 1,000 or so of them. And we have just a few teachers. There's me. There is another, actually just one more person who works in Aspen this role. And we could tap into some external people, but really it's just a few teachers. We are, the whole organization has about 20 people, and most of them are administrators. They're not Moodlers or teachers. So our capacity for teaching is very limited, but the demand is huge. So instructor evaluations, we do have them in some of our intensive courses, but generally we're moving away from that because it's not scalable. So what else? Of course, there's a Moodle quiz, and other activities. Moodle has 14 standard activities. There are many that we do use, yeah. But what about us giving students some feedback on their writing work? Now, if you take the instructor out of the picture, I think you're left with peer assessment. And there are some other things, like even a forum activity can be used to orchestrate some kind of feedback. But it's not very as structured as it is with an assignment or with peer assessment, where you can set up a proper assessment form. You can give students grades for submission, assessment. So the closest thing to the instructor evaluated assignment, I think, is peer assessment. So more than a year after I started teaching on Moodle in an intensive way, I used the Moodle workshop. So that also, I got to it a little late. It is, I suppose, not one of the things that a new teacher would try out. It can be a little intimidating. Yeah, so I used it for the first time a little over a year back in a small course, just about 40 people. Found it manageable, and there was some positive feedback. So I was a little more encouraged to use it. Anyway, this small course, it didn't really help put the workshop in the spotlight until we ran a much bigger course, which we like to call our mini MOOC. Maybe it's not so much mini, more like micro or nano MOOC, because it was, it's 267 participants in all. Wasn't 25,000 as we tend to hear from the world of MOOCs. And the starting point was, we got about 500 applications for a research writing course, an online research writing course. It was more than we expected, and I was also feeling a bit braver. I'd got my Moodle course creator certification just a short while before that. So I thought, let's try a larger group and maybe rely on peer assessment to give participants feedback on their writing. And by the way, I think the motivation for me to do peer assessment was because of the kind of course I teach. It's research writing. So it's about writing a research paper. So the course itself is about writing, and ideally the participants need to write something and get feedback on the writing. Maybe, for some other course it might not be relevant to write something. But it really is a useful activity for the kind of courses I teach. So we had 267 participants who enrolled in the course, and it was just me. I was the administrator, I was the facilitator. When I say facilitator, I mean teacher. So I was supposed to actually respond to questions from the participants and not ignore them, as happens in a MOOC with tens of thousands of students. You can't expect facilitate the teacher's attention to every post made by the students. So I still had my sort of teacher hat on. I was not just someone who just created the course and was in the background. I was really in the foreground. I was responding to students' questions. I put them in different groups. I think I used 4 groups. It was quite an effort to keep up with the forum posts. But it's good to see the students interacting with one another and responding to each other's questions. Anyway, that is not the topic of this talk about how I facilitated a course for 200 plus participants. It is more about just the peer assessment part of the course. So those of you who've used the workshop plugin, you probably know the icon that comes. So here, activity 2 is a workshop or peer assessment activity. Activity 3 is also a peer assessment activity, and there are some lessons. There's a forum activity that you see in the snapshot of one of our courses. Both these peer assessment activities were writing activities. Students had to write something and submit it. So what's a workshop? It's one of the 14 different types of activities available in a standard Moodle, and we have installed some additional ones from the Moodle plugins directory. It enables peer assessment. I mean, it is just I just copy pasted the really brief introduction to the workshop that is available on this page with a list of activities. Just 3 words: enables peer assessment. But of course, there is a lot of detailed documentation on the Moodle docs. Well, the documentation is really detailed. It's largely objective and very useful. But I think if you're getting started with using a workshop or peer assessment, I think there are some things it would help you to know, and that is really the point of my talk, to help you get started with using the workshop and to avoid some of the pitfalls which I have faced and which I have fallen into. So that's really what I'd like to go over here. So what the documentation might not really point out very well is first of all, the workshop is hard work. It is one of the more advanced activities you can orchestrate in a Moodle course. There are kind of 2 areas. One is the settings for the workshop, which are the instructions you provide to students, the grading method you set up, the assessment form you set up for the student peer assessors. And there are also stages. There is a submission stage, and then you need to allocate the submissions. There's an assessment stage where students assess each other's work. That is sort of the heart of the whole peer assessment activity. It is meant for students to assess each other's work and to leave you free to do other things. So that's kind of the heart. But for that part to work, there are other things to handle. The assessment is not just going to happen magically. Then after the assessment, there's a grading evaluation phase, and then there's a closure. I'll be going through these phases, maybe not in a very sequential way, make it a little boring, but I'll be going over my experience handling the settings and the stages, perhaps a little, not really sequentially, but more or less. This is just a screenshot of the different phases, although it is the grading evaluation phase, just something I plucked from some ongoing course, or it is actually the mini MOOC. I just put it at the grading evaluation phase. I didn't tamper with the settings too much, so ignore the highlighted grading evaluation phase, but I just like you to pay attention to the other phases: setup phase, submission phase, assessment phase, then grading evaluation, and then closed. So 5 phases or stages of a workshop, and this is really your job as a course facilitator to lead the workshop through these phases. Otherwise, it's going to cause confusion, or just might not work without, if you don't lead it through these phases. Now, I found that workshop, it can confuse students. It is, I've used maybe 6 or 7, maybe more different types of activities in Moodle, but really that nobody has been as confused with them as they've been with the workshop. So the first thing is, as a course facilitator, you have actually quite a bit to do, and I would recommend the workshop activity for a large course, because and that's when you see the full power of the workshop. And there's also quite a bit of work. It's not just going to work by itself. Like unlike when you set up a lesson or when you set up a quiz, you just set it up and it just works. You don't have to pay attention to it or keep doing something, changing the faces. But workshop, you need to really be on top of what's happening. And I wasn't so much on top. I slipped up, and I spent I just did some last minute work to fix things. So I'd like to point out some things that might help you avoid all that. So it's easy to slip up, and even then, even if you really think you're on top of things, some students might be confused what is happening, because peer assessment is not something a lot of students are used to. They're used to content, quizzes, forums, but peer assessment, not really. Yeah, that's not really that common, I think. So what my students got confused about? So there's the overall thing: why are my peers evaluating my work? There could be some students might not like it at all. They might think, no, I want the teacher to do this. I don't want other students to look at my work, let alone evaluate it. And what about the teacher? Some students feel, okay, peer evaluations, all right, but isn't the teacher going to evaluate it? Isn't that the teacher's job? Yeah, so these are concerns that might come up, and unless they're addressed up front, there might be some difficult forum posts to deal with, perhaps. So simple stuff here, just making it clear at the outset that there will be peer assessment activities, so students are not taken by surprise when they're expecting a writing activity with instructor evaluation and they find themselves in a peer assessment activity. And also explaining the point, the overall objective, even the philosophy, if you will, about how one learns by assessing others' work. And in the Moodle Docs page, I'm sure there's some useful, some philosophical arguments that you can present to students. So this is really important. It's simple enough, but it's easy to miss, and it can cause some tense posts on the forums if they're not handled. So that's the overall level. But then coming to the actual nitty-gritties. Now, so submission is clear enough. Well, it's a submission stage. There are some instructions, and students submit their work. But then assessment, that's the next stage. So this is a stage where you might need to provide more instructions. Anyway, in the workshop settings, you can provide instructions for the submission, for the assessment. But it's just a little more than just saying, well, assess the works you've received. Sometimes students don't know how to access the submissions. They might, even though you might have explained that there are peer assessment activities, and let's say it moves to the assessment stage the next week, and then there are some students who just not bothered to check the assessments, the submissions they've got for assessments. They're waiting for something. They're not assessing. So I might need to remind them how to access it. They need to do the assessments. And what if they don't understand something, don't want to evaluate it? And then there's also, you can set up the assessments. There's a setting where you can give students their own work for self-evaluation. I thought this was a pretty good thing, but this was really a lot of my students had questions about. They didn't evaluate their own work. They thought it was a mistake that they'd got their own work. So I thought there was kind of a pedagogical context setting needed there to say, well, you learn something by evaluating your own work based on the assessment form. Yeah, maybe it wasn't very obvious. So this is something, if you enable self-evaluation, can cause some students might think that's wrong. So assessment is the heart of the workshop activity, but also the most trickiest part as well. Kind of really about giving students the motivation, the context, and the incentive to do assessments in a good way. Otherwise, the workshop is not going to work well with students if they don't do assessments, or if they don't do very good assessments. And what is the point of the whole workshop or the whole peer assessment activity? The point is for students to get some meaningful feedback from their peers. Yeah, so assessment is that's a most important thing to pay attention to. Now, what I did to explain a lot of things, I found myself explaining how to do this, how to do that, and then I thought, no, this is cluttering the workshop with instructions about technical matters. So I set up a glossary separately. Initially, it was part of the course, and later I actually put it in a different part of our Moodle site so that I could use it at the site level. There was a glossary, a public glossary with auto-linked entries to really explain how to do different things in the workshop, meant for the students. And I just add the title, the glossary entry titles at different places in the course, in the workshop, and they're reusable and helps keep the workshop instructions focused on the activity at hand. Here's an example of a glossary tip. It's a snapshot. Phases of a peer assessment activity. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, so this because it's not very clear, the different phases, and it's sometimes not clear enough for the first-time teacher. So phases of a peer assessment: submission, assessment, closure. So these are for the students. Now I don't need to tell them about maybe grading, evaluation, or the setup phase. That's more for me. But I need to tell them what they are going to see. And also, I made the course with giving them either partial credit for a peer assessment activity and full credit. So partial credit is where they either do only the submission or only the assessment, and full credit if they do both. So those are other glossary entries which are linked from within this glossary. So I remember at the Moodle conference a couple of years back, the only Moodle live conference I attended in Dublin, there was, I think, someone who was talking about the glossary as the Swiss Army knife of Moodle, and it indeed is. You can do a lot with it. This is one use. So I put the glossary tip. So here you can see where I put it. It's under activity 4, which is a peer assessment activity, research abstract. So after the activity is closed, I put the title of the glossary, of the relevant glossary link, and so it's just a link sitting there, and maybe I'll show you. Yeah, it's just a pop-up. When you click it, the tip pops up about how to see the peer assessments that the student has got. I thought I had a snapshot of that. Maybe it's a little later. It comes a little later. So let's have to go back a bit. So that's the assessment stage, an overview. I mean, I know I'm not covering all of it. It's quite intricate, but hopefully, it's giving you a picture of what's happening in a workshop. So there is a thing about allocating submissions from submission to assessment. How do you allocate that? Allocate the submissions to the students. So the 3 ways: manual, random, and schedule. Manual is where you manually choose the assessors for every submission. I've never used that because unless you're dealing with a small group of students, it's not going to be feasible, I think. So it's really more random or schedule that's relevant for a larger online course. Now, I think they're very similar. The random is when you decide to do the allocation, and schedule is when it happens at a certain time. If you set deadlines for the submission and assessment in the workshop settings, scheduled allocation might be useful. I tend to use scheduled allocation. Most of the settings seem to be the same. If you look at the allocation settings part here and on this slide, I think they're the same. Yeah, schedule is a few more settings. Enable schedule allocation. So you can automatically allocate it. So there's one less thing for you to do if you're running a course on a schedule. You can just enable schedule allocation. So that's really one less thing. And otherwise, you have to go in and randomly allocate it at the right time. So you can do a number of things. Maybe this has a better view. So you can use number of reviews, how many per submission. If you want to remove any current allocation, sort of redo the allocations, you can remove that. And you can let participants assess without having submitted anything. It's up to you. Or you can keep it kind of closed, like a tight group. Only those who have submitted can assess. And then adding self-assessments. I think these are simple enough settings here. And so this is where the magic is. After random or scheduled allocations, all the submissions are automatically distributed among the students for assessments. Well, but as long as you've remembered to do the switch from the submission to the assessment phase, either manually by changing the space, or by enabling the feature in the schedule allocation. If you're wondering, well, what are these switching things? The bulb, switch the bulb on. I think this is it's a bit of a unique feature of the workshop. I didn't do this the first time I ran the course. I thought it was in the submission phase when it was in the setup phase.
I just thought I even got one thing out of it that I could pass on to the facilitators.
I can hear somebody talking. I'm not muted. Anyway, I'll just keep talking. I left it at the setup phase, and I told students, all right, this week is the submission phase of the peer. You have to submit your work. I didn't say submission phase. I hadn't noticed there was that phase. I said you have to submit your work. Next week you do the assessments, and so like, but I don't know. I can't see any box to upload my work. And then that is when I learned, okay, I didn't put it in the submission phase. So you just switch the bulb on at the relevant place. If it's a submission phase, you click that bulb, switch it on. Assessment, you put this on. So that's really, really important. Even if you've done everything else, if you've not switched the right bulb on, it's not going to work. It's not going to work the way you think it's working. So it's one thing for those of you who are using the workshop for the first time. It's a key phrase, I think, the bulb, switching it on. So so this is submission, assessment. There's also another thing in between, as part of this, is the assessment form. Again, that is related to the core, which is phase. The core phase is the assessment, and as part of that is the assessment form. So what are the assessors going to do? Are they just going to write up their feedback in a free form text box? I don't think you would want that, maybe, unless because there are just a lot of other things you can do to set up the assessment form. It's more than just a text box to give feedback. And okay, there's a question to phase on, even using the automatic allocation. Does the phase from submission to assessment go automatically? If the scheduled allocation, there's an automatic thing that's turned on there. Well, I'm not very sure, to be honest, but it's just best to check. Actually, the scheduled allocation, let's just go back there for a bit. Yeah, the scheduled allocation, it says automatically allocate submissions at the end of the submission phase. So that means that the submissions are allocated, but I don't think that means the phase changes from submission to assessment. That's what I recall. It's been a few months since I ran this course, many months actually. So it's best to check. Even if you've done this enable scheduled allocation, it's just best to check if the assessment phase has is on. Oh, all right, move further ahead. Sorry. Yeah, so the nature, there are many types of assessment forms. Of course, the assessment form is completely yours to develop with statements, rubrics. Yeah, so rubric. Yeah, get that kind of stuff in the workshop. So it depends on the grading strategy you choose in the main workshop settings. So here's a quick look at the grading strategy options. So this is the main workshop settings, the edit settings, the workshop level. So there are 4 options. Yeah, I hope this is somewhat clear. Cumulative grading, comments, number of errors, rubric. Yeah, now we're getting to the deep end of the workshop, Moodle workshop. So it's the deep end where I've not really swam a lot. Yeah, Moodle, as most of you probably know, it provides complex ways of including assessment, doing assessment, different activities, including workshop. I am not an assessment expert, and the context in which I work, because I don't work at a university or school, I work in a sort of tertiary education where so far assessment has not been that important to us. It's more about giving learners, adult learners, good learning experience. We don't grade them so much. It's really not been important so far. So as a result, I've not had the remit to focus on to really delve into assessment. I've set up some basic assessment forms. So unfortunately, I can't be your guide for workshop assessment. But this is one form I've used, a simple one called the number of errors. That's a grading strategy. So here, for example, this is how it works. You set up a series of assertion statements in the assessment form. And then there are 2 options for the assessors, no or yes. And then there's a comment they can provide. The comment is optional. I think it's one of the simpler forms. I'd like to try out the other ones like accumulative grading and rubric, maybe in a future course. So this is what the assessors see. And the form that you're seeing now is relevant to the research abstract assignment. So there's an assertion. A broad overview or background for the study is presented at the beginning of the abstract, no or yes, and then a comment. And then there's a second assertion. I think there are 7 or 8 assertion statements in all. And the assessors have to assess each submission with this assessment form. So, yeah, I think might be getting a picture of how much work is involved in setting up a workshop. In fact, the assessment form could be most of the work if you want to really make it thorough and detailed, and maybe matching any kind of institutional guidelines about assessment. It could be a lot of work, but I'm sure it could be quite exciting also, because there are 4 types of grading strategies, and then within that you can set up your own assessment form. So you do have a lot of freedom. Yeah, I agree with Tim. It's yeah, if you have to do all that, give all that feedback, that's a lot more work. So if you set it all up, and then it works with one batch of students, the next batch of students, and all you have to do is orchestrate the activity. Yeah, so after assessment, we're reaching sort of the end of the workshop life cycle, also this presentation. The student's job, so basically the student's job is a submission assessment. Your job as a course teacher or facilitator is to set up the workshop, instructions, and the assessment form, allocate the submissions manually or automatically with the random or scheduled allocation at the right time, handling the grading evaluation stage. So we've looked at these things except the grading evaluation. Let's look at that very briefly. Again, this is sort of the deep end of the Moodle workshop activity. Now, what I'm going to do very lazily is give you some excerpts from Moodle docs, because I can't explain it any better, and I'm not an expert in this area. So the grading evaluation is where students get grades for two things: for their own submission and for the assessment they did. Now, for their own submission, it's easy enough. Moodle calculates a grade based on the grades or the feedback they've got from their assessors. But giving them grades for the kind of assessment they did, I think that's a more complex one. And I just read up that there is some artificial intelligence happening there. So, yeah, high-tech stuff, which I'm not on top of. I just use the default settings, which are these that you see here in the grading evaluation stage. When you switch the bulb on to that stage, you'll see these settings. I have explored them a bit, but I've just use the default to calculate the grades and move on. Again, something for me to explore. It's complex stuff. It's not as simple as 1, 2, 3. Of course, there's a lot of documentation about this. If you have the time to go through it and really be a master of the workshop. Here's an excerpt from the Moodle Docs page. Process is deterministic. About this is about how the grade for the student's assessment work is calculated, not the grade for their submission, which is a simpler one, but giving them a grade for their assessment. Oh, I think this is brilliant, actually, that there is such a system. If only the ironic thing is the work that I do in scientific communication, there is a lot of debate about peer reviewers in scientific communication and how good they are, how bad they are, how variable they are. Or maybe the Moodle philosophy can be applied to evaluate the peer reviewers in research communication. Anyway, that's something for me to recommend somewhere, I think. Anyway, this is a bit of the deep end. I leave you to explore it once you've mastered the basics. And so I'm not an expert. I don't think you really need to master all the grading stuff. I haven't. Yet I've run a course for more than 2 students at a time, and actually I've used peer assessment in a few more courses. It works well enough. And I'm sure the best part is it can work better, and it's up to me to explore that. But as it is, I think it's working. It's doing a good job, and a lot of students have got something useful out of it. And I do think grading evaluation, any setting you use, will be equally fair or equally unfair to all the students. But it really depends on how important grading is in your context. So if it's really, really important, then maybe you need to spend more time in understanding how the grading works to choose the right one. It's not so important in my context, so good for me. After grading evaluation, every student gets a grade for their submitted work and a grade for their assessments. They get 2 grades. Grade for their submitted work, as I said, is, I think, simple enough based on the assessments they got from their peer assessors. Actually, it's not so simple. There are some complex formulas that I saw on the Moodle docs just now. But grade for their assessments is really even more complex. Anyway, they do get grades. And once that happens, you have to close the workshop so students can see the assessments and grades. Again, we go back to the importance of switching the workshop from one phase to another. And please remember the bulb. And anyway, when you move to the closure phase, this is the message you'll see. You'll see this message that the students will see their submissions and their submission assessments, and their grades will appear in the grade book. And to switch it from the grading evaluation to close it, let's see what I have here. Yes, remember the bulb. Please click the bulb at near the closed button, that word. So to close the workshop and wrap it up. So you wrapped it up, but there could be some confusion there as well among students. So some students I've worked with, they didn't know how to access peer assessments. I told them, all right, peer assessments ready, go and look at that. And they were like, well, where? So I think might be some user interface work to improve the visibility of the assessments. It might be nice to have something like, well, your assessments are ready somewhere, view them. But instead, students have to go into their own assessments and click a few things. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of that, but it would be nice to have a better user interface in that juncture. So anyway, my fix is to again use the Swiss Army knife of Moodle, the glossary, to create an entry called "Seeing Peer Assessments You've Received." That seems to work well enough, and I think that was the one I pointed out a little earlier. And yeah, so that's on the course homepage itself. As soon as the peer assessments are ready, I put in the glossary entry right under where the relevant activity. And when they click that, they get this tip. I just explained what they need to do, but yeah, that seems to have fixed the problem of some students getting confused about how to access peer assessments. Okay, kind of moving a bit fast here because looking at the time. I've reached the end of the talk. I want to just point out what the students I taught thought of the whole peer assessment thing. There were 181 course completers among the 267 participants. Not bad, I think. Much better than the 10 to 20% that we see in MOOCs. And also because this was a facilitated course. It wasn't kind of survival of the fittest kind of MOOC. I was there to provide some level of technical support, definitely a good deal of sort of the subject area support, answering students' questions was manageable. There were 180 students completed and gave feedback. So this is really from the Moodle feedback analysis. So I wanted to know what they felt like doing the assessments, and there was even an option about I did the assessments only because I wanted to get credit for the activity. Well, the feedback was anonymous, so hopefully it was the anonymous mode in this Moodle feedback form. Hopefully they were being honest. So assume they're being honest enough. So it does seem like most students enjoyed assessing the work of their peers, and it seems like more than that, it seemed to be a useful experience, with 87% saying that it was a useful experience. And very few people have indicated, marked some of the negative options. Yeah, so it seems to have worked with this large group. And here is another question. Please tell us what you thought of the feedback you received. The previous question was about how they felt doing the assessments. And this question is about what they thought of the assessments they got. Most people said, 67% said it was useful. So not high enough, but it's a start. 24% said they would have liked to get better feedback. And not surprisingly, 33% thought that if they'd been given feedback from the course facilitator, the activity would have been much more useful. So yeah, so there is something to do here. I think there is. So this is really, as I mentioned, it is the part of the peer assessment activities, the assessment stage. You can set up a grading strategy. You can set up an assessment form. You have a lot of flexibility in that. There's also the question of rewarding, maybe a little outside the settings, is really what is the incentive for people to give feedback? There is, of course, the incentive of the assessment grade. Now, but I think if that is positioned as an incentive, I think you need to understand a bit about how the assessment grade works. Or you can give some other incentive, as I have done. The incentive I've given is they must assess all the submissions they've got in order to receive credit. It's more of a participation-oriented grading than a performance-oriented grading. Anyway, that's yeah. There is quite a bit you can do there, and I can do there also to improve the improve the number of people who say peer feedback was useful. Hopefully, say it's something like 80% or more. This question here, can you see as a teacher who didn't give feedback to an, oh, certainly, you can see, now I didn't want to show screenshots of that portion because they have the students' names in my course. You can definitely see who didn't give feedback. You can download the report, the workshop, kind of the grading report And then you can even do a finer analysis. You can look at the logs to see who has submitted what, who has assessed what. But yes, the short answer is yes, you can see who didn't give feedback to an assignment submission. In fact, the first, there's a very visual display in the grading evaluation phase, which I haven't shown. You just scroll down and you can see, you can easily see which students have not given any feedback. And you might come across some students who have been assigned, say, 4 submissions. They've given feedback for 1 or 2. So you can look at all that. And that's what I used to give them the participation credit. And that was the incentive I gave them, not so much the assessment grade itself. Anyway, there's a lot you can do here. Yeah, so it's really up to you. And if you're interested, I've set up a sample workshop. Hopefully, I've done it right. It's a very basic activity. You could, if you'd like, it's on the presentation space, this presentation space. And it's in the submission phase. If you'd like, you can submit a dummy document with just nothing in it or just some dummy text, in the next 10 minutes. And if you have a few submissions, I'll move it to the assessment stage. I'll allocate it. You get somebody else's assessment. So yeah, up to you. Let's see if there are a few participants. You can see how it works. Get an idea of the whole thing. Yeah, so I've got to the end of my talk. Hopefully it wasn't too long or too short. There is a forum. I will be looking at it, the standard forum on this presentation space. If you have any questions, you could post there. You could email me, and I'm on Twitter as well. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining, and I hope you learned something. All right, we have a question here. If this links in with the Ajax marking module. Well, I don't know. I'm personally not. I don't think I know about this module. I suppose, Lynn, it is a plugin. It's not part of the standard Moodle, so I wouldn't know. I'm sorry. But well, you can download the workshop. You can look at the visual report. You can download the grading sheet to see who has submitted work. Okay. All right. Thanks, Lindy, for answering Lynn's question. Elton, very interested in using Moodle synchronously. Progressing through, well, I haven't done this myself, Elton. I haven't progressed through the phases of a workshop within a single 90-minute classroom session. But I think it should work because it is 90 minutes. If you said 10 minutes, it'd be tough. But you maybe, even if students have to prepare their own work, maybe something like a speed writing activity, they get 15 minutes to do that. They upload their work. You can even, you don't even have to bother with the deadlines. Set the deadlines. You could have a speed writing activity, for example. They upload their work. You do the random allocation. You give people 15 minutes to do the evaluation. And yeah, you close it up. But of course, you would need to set it up in advance. Spend the previous day or night setting up the assessment form and the settings. So I think in a case like this, yeah, I agree with Lindy. Be ruthless on time frames. Maybe more as a teacher, just shouting at them in the classroom than relying on the settings. But more the phases, you really need to be on top of that so that there is no confusion. So if there are any slip-ups, then that could waste valuable time and distract from the overall activity. But yeah, it should be interesting and possible. Okay, yeah, time writing, yeah. So, well, the thing is, I don't teach in a classroom. I'm mostly an online teacher. I sometimes facilitate workshops, but it's not in a university or school context. So, yeah, I think there are even more possibilities when you work in that context. Okay, so I guess we could wrap it up. Unless there are more questions, because there's always a forum as well. So Thank you very much. And if Suzanne is still on to do any wrap up.
Yes. Hi, Ravi. I was talking, but I forgot to unclick my mic. Thank you very much for that. We appreciate all your time and effort in that presentation. And like you said, everyone can go to the forums if they've got any other questions for you. And so that's really good. Okay. And you can stay here for a little bit longer, or you can all just leave. That's great. Thanks again, Ravi.
Thanks, Suzanne.